Okay, so this is the second installment of 9.4 Economics in a Global Age, and it is about new economic institutions, multinational corporations, and regional trade agreements. So, this is what the College Board has to say and what they want us to know. Changing economic institutions, multinational corporations, and regional trade agreements reflected the spread of principles and practices associated with those free market economics that we talked about in the first episode throughout the world. So, two economic institutions that we're going to talk about are the World Bank and the IMF, or the International Monetary Fund. So, both the IMF and the World Bank are created in 1944 at this summit in Bretton Woods. I'm pretty sure it's in New Hampshire. Woods. Hosted to try and create a global economic structure that will prevent the failings of the economic system that led to the Great Depression from happening again. So essentially, yep, what Bretton Woods does is a few things. It creates these two organizations, and then it also establishes a way to regulate currency exchange. So the kind of primary currency in the world will be the US dollar. So convenient for us. And the US dollar will be tied to gold. It'll be tied to $35 per ounce of gold. And the United States gold is kept in Fort Knox. And yeah, other currencies of the original founding members, other currencies are tied to the US dollar. So, like a British pound is worth X number of dollars. That's the way that the system is structured. And eventually it lasts till about 1973. These organizations still exist, but the Bretton Woods like gold standard of tying the dollar to gold ends with President Nixon. But let's talk about these two organizations. So, the World Bank, this guy, is an international finance institution that provides loans and grants to governments of poor countries for the purpose of pursuing capital projects, so like infrastructure and such. And it's founded in 1944. Originally, it has two parts. The first part is the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which is created in Europe in order to kind of put the Marshall Plan and the reconstruction of Europe into place. And then the other one is called the International Development Association, but they are kind of joined into the World Bank after the end of World War II. The second one, the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, is also one of these Bretton Woods, right, 1944 organizations. And right now it has 189 member states. And what they do is they work together to, quote, foster global monetary cooperation, promote global financial stability, increase international trade, and reduce poverty. Um, the way that they say that they are going to do this is through capacity building. Capacity building is essentially like building the countries who are getting the loans, building their ability to have good economies themselves. So, like training, advisors, stuff like that, and also loans. Um, so they make loans to countries who are experiencing economic distress to kind of try and stop a big financial crisis from happening, especially if they're part of a global or a regional system. So, like, say you're part of the Eurozone. We don't want you to crash because then you're going to drag the whole euro down with you. So the IMF could give you a loan to kind of bail you out. Um, Sometimes this works really well, and sometimes it doesn't. One of the things that they do is they kind of make, if you're getting a loan from them, there are certain things that you have to do. Like you often have to adopt this thing called austerity measures, which would be like cutting pensions for government workers, cutting uh, government programs, so education, welfare, any infrastructure programs, any of that. And also dropping all of your tariffs and protective trade measures that you have. So, for example, in Jamaica, um, when they got a loan, they had to drop all of their trade restrictions, and they had some protectionist measures that protected like the dairy industry and the banana industry and some things like kind of unique to Jamaica. And so when they got this loan, they had to drop all of that. And so the dairy industry in Jamaica completely collapsed, because cheap powdered milk could be imported from the United States, and it just put all of the Jamaican dairy farmers out of business. Hopefully, then those Jamaican dairy farmers could find something else to do, kind of in the long run, but in the short run, we see the collapse of that industry. So that's kind of an example of how, sometimes these policies aren't always adapted in ways that help people in the short term. So the other thing that we're going to talk about is multinational corporations. So, multinational or transnational corporations are corporations that produce and deliver goods and services across country lines. So, they could be headquartered anywhere in the world, they could ship all the way everywhere, they could have multiple offices and locations and factories. Um, and what we've seen after World War II is essentially this massive growth in the power and stature of corporations. That corporations like Microsoft and Apple and Google have so much power and control, they're able to kind of throw their weight around to influence government policy and world international policy, um, in a way that's just unprecedented. In fact, 51 out of 100 of the largest economic units in the world are corporations. So that means that there are countries who don't have as big of economies as businesses. Um, like ExxonMobil is one of the biggest. I haven't seen it reworked since kind of the growth of information capitalism with Google and everything, but like General Motors, ExxonMobil, Microsoft, all of these companies, Coca-Cola, all of these companies have huge influence, and just there's so much money and power behind them. And a lot of this, the fact that these companies are multinational, can lead to a process called deindustrialization. So essentially, essentially, right, if I am a company headquartered in the United States and like I'm General Motors, for example, and I have some factories in Detroit that build cars, and I pay American workers to build my cars, but then I'm also, because I am a multinational corporation, I'm like, oh, well, maybe I'll build a factory in Mexico. So I build a factory in Mexico, and now I realize after building my factory in Mexico that it costs way less to employ Mexicans than it does to employ Americans. So I close my factory in Detroit and I shift all of my factories to other parts of the world where it is cheaper. So the United States becomes deindustrialized. And this happens a lot in Western Europe as well, right? That because these corporations can cross country lines, right, they can build their factories wherever they want. So the last thing we're going to talk about is regional trade agreements. So we're going to talk about two of them. We're going to talk about NAFTA, RIP, and we're going to talk about the EEC, or the European Economic Community, which grows into the Eurozone. And NAFTA is the North American Free Trade Agreement. It is now being renegotiated as the USMCA. So NAFTA, it is finalized and goes into effect on January 1st, let me put this over here, 1994, which is very similar to this. I'm pretty sure this is 93 when it becomes the European Economic Community. But so NAFTA is an agreement, it's North America, so it's Canada, the United States, and Mexico. It first originates because the United States and Canada are pursuing bilateral talks, and then the United States and Mexico are pursuing bilateral talks, and then the three of them are like, well, why don't we just do this together? So they negotiate together, and basically what NAFTA does is it eliminates tariffs between the three countries, progressively, so it did that over time. To the point where all duties and quantitative restrictions, so quantitative restrictions would be like the number of X products that can be imported to a certain member country, are eliminated by 2008. So that's what NAFTA intended to do, right? To drop trade barriers between the United States, Canada, and Mexico. There were people who really benefited from NAFTA, and there were people who really didn't benefit from NAFTA. So it was a highly controversial program, and that's part of why uh, it was renegotiated recently into the USMCA. So here's a political cartoon kind of criticizing what NAFTA did. So you can see the kind of fat cat, so to speak, in the middle is corporate America. And he says, free trade at last, free trade at last. Thank God Almighty, we have free trade at last. So corporate America is super happy. In fact, he's like quoting Martin Luther King Jr. That's how happy he is. And he's holding a shackle, right? Like a handcuff. And the handcuff that he is going to use to handcuff someone is the WTO, which is the World Trade Organization. It supervises international trade and likes free trade agreements. So it can also be used as a weapon. It is against Jamaica. I can tell that story when I talk about the World Trade Organization in a different episode. And then a whip, right? NAFTA is seen as a whip. Think about what that means, right? To kind of coerce workers, right? And so who's sad? US workers are sad. They're chained by massive layoffs and vanishing worker rights. Workers abroad are sad because they're paid slave wages and they don't have worker rights. So you, right, kind of this idea that the workers lose and corporate America wins. NAFTA, for example, starts off a rebellion in southern Mexico. I'll talk about this in a different episode, in reactions to globalization, but in a state in Mexico called Chiapas, and it's a movement called the Zapatistas, who are basically like an independence rebel group in southern Mexico because northern Mexico really benefits from NAFTA, but southern agricultural Mexico does not. And then the next one we're going to talk about is the EEC, right, which becomes the Eurozone. And um, it really begins after World War II, right? So, okay, Europe is tired of fighting Europe. And so after World War II, they start to think about, also this is in the context of the Cold War, so we have to keep that in mind, that that should always be in the background, that this is happening in the Cold War, post World War II in Europe. And they're trying to think of political and economic ways that they can join together to eliminate the conditions that have led to inter-European conflicts. So in 1957, they form a common market. It's the kind of this idea of European integration in Europe. And it also starts a customs union. So this idea that going through, like crossing a border within Europe will not require you to go through customs every single time, but they have agreed upon what is allowed in, what is not allowed in. That way, once you're in, you can move freely in Europe, right? And it's supposed to guarantee the free movement of goods, capital, as in funds, services, and people. And oops, it's it's been controversial. So a few years ago, I was in Greece, and actually it was, I think it was 2015. May have been, yeah, 2015. And in 2014, Greece had essentially their economy was collapsing. Um, the Greek economy was never strong. When they entered into the euro, they had to receive huge loans. The way they transitioned from the Greek currency to the euro was completely and utterly flawed. And the Greek economy just was too underdeveloped to really kind of be like aligned with the German economy or the Dutch economy or the Belgian economy or the French economy. So, um, because of this, they experienced this huge economic crisis. And the tour guide that we're with, he's Dutch. And he's very Dutch. And we're touring around Greece, and we get to this bridge that's built with European Union, Eurozone money. And he's just kind of bitter about it because he's like, look, does it annoy me that I'm Dutch and the Dutch people work so hard and our economy is so developed and we've tried so hard to put ourselves back together after the war? And the Greeks just show up, they cook their books, right? Essentially, when they joined the Eurozone, you have to submit your financial records as a government. And apparently the Greek records were just not right. So it made them look like they were better off than they were. So he's like, and the Greeks just like cooked their books and they get all of this money from the European Union. They build this fancy bridge, and then they like can't put their house in order and collapse. He's like, and now we have to pay for them to get fixed. He's like, so we're paying for it double. He's like, does that annoy me? Yes. However, he's like, this is the longest period of time that we have ever gone without a European war. He's like, so what's it worth to me? Is it worth not having a European war to bail out the Greeks? Yes, it is. And that's kind of where he sat with it. So when we look at this political cartoon, you can see it's about Brexit, which you've probably heard about. Right, it says Britain may quit the EU. This is Angela Merkel, the German chancellor. And they're all like, oh no, sad, right? He's biting his teeth. And then the Greek representative is like, oh, but I'm staying. And then this guy's like, oh, great, yay. Right? So it's intended to promote inter-European cooperation, and it has definitely done that. So while there are definitely detractors and there are definitely flaws to the Eurozone and to all regional trade agreements, it depends on what your goal is, right? If your goal is to increase cooperation and decrease the risk of conflict, then cool. If your goal is to protect workers and protect your own native industries, then probably not, right? It just depends on what you want.